In this video, I'm going to draw several pixel art pumpkins and even do some animation. As a warm-up, I'm going to quickly sketch out a bunch of pumpkins at the same time. I start my pixel art pumpkin brainstorm by painting several rather abstract shapes. I try to make these asymmetrical and I use different colors for each. Then I start adding lines to define the sections of each pumpkin. I use dark and light lines to add variety. I add some big blobby highlights to each pumpkin to make each section feel more round. I paint some highlights and shadows on the tops and bottoms of each pumpkin. I also try to add some more line detail into the shadows to give them a rounder feel. With some dark greens and browns, I block in the stems. I even add a curlicue vine to one stem. Once the pumpkins are done, I add a new layer and start carving them into jack-o'-lanterns. I try to make some shapes for their faces that match the shapes of the pumpkins. I use really dark orange, yellow, and sometimes red to create these different faces. Here I'm giving one 3 eyes. This guy's pretty happy about something. This squiggly line mouth is inspired by Charlie Brown and Peanuts characters. I give this last one lots of eyes like a spider. And that's how I quickly create several different jack-o'-lanterns. In a 128 by 128 image, I start by doing a rough sketch of a pumpkin with a 1 pixel brush. I sketch the stem with a lighter color so it stands out from the other lines. Then on a new layer, I draw dark orange-red lines. Here I'm drawing with a 2 pixel brush in case I want to scale this image down to 64 by 64. That way my lines don't all disappear when there are less pixels. I fill in the pumpkin with a dark orange color, and then I draw some shapes that will be the main orange color of the pumpkin. On a new layer, I draw a stem. I temporarily make the pumpkin layer transparent so I can see my rough sketch. When you pull a pumpkin from the vine, its stem turns brown. I'm using some lighter browns to give the stem some details. I draw some highlights with a light orange color. I do 2 highlights for each section of the pumpkin to give it that sort of striped detail that pumpkins have. Now I'm adding some shadows to the bottom of the pumpkin with a darker color, and then adding some even darker lines in the corners at the very bottom of the pumpkin. I check things in my preview window to see how this pumpkin looks when it's smaller. Now it's time to draw a face on my pumpkin and make this a jack-o'-lantern. On a new layer, I start out with black, then fill in those shapes with red, leaving some of the black as an outline. Then I paint in the yellow light of the eyes and mouth, and then add a bit of very bright yellow to give it a sense that a candle is glowing in there. Before I'm done, I add a few more details to the stem, and I wasn't completely happy with the mouth, so I paint a few more options to see which I like best. That's it for this pixel pumpkin. To start a 64 by 64 pumpkin sprite, I start out with a basic shape. Then I like to start my darker lines by outlining the center section and then making the lines on each side. I fill in just the center of each section with the main orange color. This makes it feel more round and creates some shadows between the sections. I add some dark lines on the top and the bottom and add highlights on the right side. I add a brown stem that spreads out a few pixels around the base where it connects to the pumpkin. On another layer, I add dark brown cutouts for the eyes and mouth. Then I fill in their centers with yellow. I decide that he needs a nose, and that's my finished 64 by 64 pumpkin sprite. For a 32 by 32 sprite, I do a rough sketch to get the shape just right. Since I'm working at a small scale, I turn on pixel perfect lines to have clean lines that are only 1 pixel in width. I carefully draw the sections of the pumpkin, trying to keep the space rather even. I fill in with my dark orange, paint just the centers of each section with the main orange color to help create that rounded feel. I paint in a stem. I draw some highlights and make some darker lines on the top and bottom. Then I check how things look at a smaller scale in my preview window and carefully carve away at the shape to make it feel more round. On a new layer, I paint the face on with dark brown and yellow. When I turn on my preview window, I decide that maybe the dark brown is too much, and I try some lighter colors on parts of the face outline. Not 100% sold on the face, so I make a new layer and make another face. This time I have the preview window open the whole time and try to paint a face with the smaller scale in mind. I think I'm happy with this look for my 32 by 32 pumpkin. When making a 16 by 16 pumpkin sprite, I start out with the circle tool. Then I make the circle wider by a couple pixels. I color in the pumpkin, then I start painting pixels one by one, trying to create the alternating lights and darks that make up each section of the pumpkin. I make a sort of checkerboard pattern on the bottom to give it some shading and a hint of detail. A pixel line on the top makes it feel a bit more round. On a new layer, I pixel paint a face. I try to make it symmetrical. I also add some red pupils because I feel like these read better as eyes now. I'm feeling pretty good with the 16 by 16 pumpkin sprite. It might fit right into Stardew Valley. Here are all the different size sprites together. Luckily, I have lots of my own reference photos for jack-o'-lanterns, since I take a photo of my pumpkin carving every year. I'm using a 2-pixel brush to block most everything in. I don't want to focus on the little details just yet. The colors in the photo are a little pink and too dark for my tastes, so I'm using more cartoony colors to make my pixel art. Once all the main shapes are blocked in, I add some more fine details with a very dark brown 1-pixel brush. Here's a pumpkin carving tip. You can use pieces left over from the eyes and stick them to the sides of the head with toothpicks to make ears. Once the ears and stem are added, this jack-o'-lantern is just about finished. This next pumpkin is a challenge because it's so dimly lit. I sketch out the basic shape. With the area of the pumpkin selected, I'm able to add these brush strokes all the way up to the edge of the pumpkin. I add some darker and darker areas to the center of the pumpkin to try to match that lighting in the photo. Once I start on the face, I don't feel like the eyes and mouth are working quite the way I wanted, so I scrap my first attempt and then go with some more simple face design. I keep the same shape, but I make the face with way less detail. After making such a bright face, the pumpkin feels extra dark now, so I add some more bright orange highlights to the pumpkin. The only thing left is to add the stem. On this last pumpkin, all I have for reference is this creepy photo of a jack-o'-lantern face in the dark. So I imagine what the silhouette of the pumpkin would look like before I start drawing on the face. I draw the menacing mouth and eyes with purple, orange, and yellow. Finally, I add some rim lights to the edge and some orange highlights spilling around the edge of the pumpkin. Here are my 3 finished pumpkins, all drawn from reference. For a bouncy pumpkin animation, I start drawing just with a basic pumpkin shape. On the next frame, I make the pumpkin be squashed down in anticipation. Then I draw it stretching up taller. This is going to be a 4-frame animation, so I draw an in-between between the 3rd and 1st frame. This is the animation so far. I think it's looking pretty good. Now let's start adding some colors and details to the pumpkin. Because the pumpkin changes shape on every frame, it's okay if I just eyeball all of these highlight areas. Getting it close is fine. Consistency from frame to frame isn't too important. I add a stem and I try to make it have some overlap and follow through. When the pumpkin moves down, the stem lags behind. However, I don't really have enough frames for proper follow through, so this will probably be good enough. Now it's time to carve the face into our pumpkin on a new layer. I draw the face on the left side of the pumpkin as if we're viewing his face from a 3/4 angle. When I put this sprite in a game, I'll be able to flip it horizontally and make it look like he's bouncing left or right. I eyeball the first 3 face frames, and then for the 4th frame, I turn off my pumpkin layer so I can do a proper in-between between the 3rd and 1st frames. Once the face is looking pretty good, I fill it in with yellow so it looks like there's a candle in there. The animation's looking good. I just want to add a few more dark lines to the bottom of the pumpkin to give it a tiny bit of shadow. Now that the animation is finished, I export the 4 frames on one sprite sheet. I import the sprite sheet into Godot and test out how the animation looks in my game. Since I don't have a game created for my pumpkin animation yet, I try it out in a game I made earlier this year. Here's what that bouncing animation looks like when it's chasing the player and wandering around the level. The pumpkin sprite flips to face the player wherever he is at on the screen. Overall, this is a very basic animation and a simple setup, but you might get away with it if this is just one of dozens of monsters bouncing around on the screen. I hope you enjoyed making some pixel art pumpkins with me. I'm still just getting started out in my game development journey, so if you could give me a like and a subscribe here on YouTube, I'd appreciate it. And maybe check out some of my other videos where I made a game with clay animation, or another one where I created animations for a game all hand drawn on paper. Thanks again. See you next time.